Many believe they are invincible. The men of the Wehrmacht.
It was hammered into us from the beginning that we were the best soldiers in the world. And after so many successes, we believed it ourselves. We are the best soldiers in the world.
Then they invaded the Soviet Union. And everything changed.
After 9 months, I was the only one left of the company that marched into Russia, out of 240 men.
They were a shadow of their former selves. How did the wave of victories come to an end? What were the soldiers really thinking? Trent Park in England. Captured German officers have been held here in luxury since 1942. Believing they're unobserved, they speak freely. One topic dominates: the Russian campaign.
The Russians have destroyed our aura of invincibility. We have sacrificed the flower of our nation's youth, and our best divisions are dead and buried.
The English newspapers are right. They say we are suffering from delusions of grandeur.
They say, you are arseholes. You have become megalomaniacs. You have gambled everything on one card. And you have lost everything in Russia.
And everything was going so well. It was all perfect. And then it went downhill because of bloody Russia. There were 2 people who didn't know that Russia gets cold in winter. One was Napoleon Bonaparte and the other was the Führer, our amateur strategist. Everyone else knew.
The captive German officers don't realize the British Secret Service is listening to every word they say. Now the secret transcripts of those conversations have been released. Historian Sönke Neitzel has evaluated them. Never before and never again did the officers of the Wehrmacht speak so openly.
It's fascinating to explore how they perceived the failure of the war in Russia. It's especially interesting how early they began to push responsibility away from the Wehrmacht and on to Hitler. Hitler was the guilty one.
All the senior people who understood anything about it, whether they were economists or officers, they all advised against the attack on Russia. They said it just cannot work. You can't fight a blitzkrieg against Russia.
Of course, these comments by the imprisoned generals are attempts at self-justification. When you look at other sources, it becomes very clear that the war in Russia was the war of the German generals. Hitler didn't have to force them into this war. They wanted it, and they wanted it exactly the way it was fought.
The invasion of the Soviet Union is imminent. Operation Barbarossa. It's a fateful moment. That's clear to everyone. Hans Erdmann Schönbeck went straight from school into a panzer regiment.
We were all very excited. Me especially, of course. I was 18, and it was my first experience of combat. First, we fired a murderous barrage at the Russian lines.
A barrage like you can't imagine. The whole skyline was lit up in flames. Then we were told to advance.
Student Heinz Otto Fausten was in the mechanized infantry. It's his first experience of war.
We hadn't been moving for more than 5 minutes when our first dispatch rider was wounded.
This will be a war the like of which no one has seen before. A war of annihilation launched on an unsuspecting enemy. Propaganda has made the soldiers believe they're preempting a Soviet attack. Even today, this claim is sometimes found in the literature. But historian Bernd Wegener has researched the Russian campaign in depth.
We know Stalin fully expected that the Soviet Union would be involved in this war of the great powers at some time. And in fact, he attempted to prepare the Red Army for it. But there's no indication he was planning an imminent attack himself. Hitler didn't attack the Soviet Union because he thought the Red Army was so strong, but because he considered it so weak.
The Wehrmacht marches into the Soviet Union along a 1,500-kilometer front with more than 3 million men. This is to be a blitzkrieg, defeat the Red Army close to the border and capture Moscow within 8 weeks. The Red Army greatly outnumbers the Wehrmacht. The ratio of tanks is 5-to-1. Was the invasion an act of madness or a calculated risk with a chance of success? That's what British historian Richard Overy believes.
Some people argue that Hitler had really lost the war as soon as he invaded the Soviet Union, but I think that that is simple hindsight. We know what the final outcome was in 1945, but it was far, far from predictable in 1941. Across the world, most people thought the Soviet Union would be defeated. In Washington, Roosevelt was told that probably a few weeks at best. In Britain, too, the judgment of the Red Army's capability was very limited. I mean, if Germany could defeat the French army in a matter of 6 weeks, they really thought the Red Army would crumble away.
The tank regiments were the Wehrmacht's trump card. They were the most modern in the world. The German victory over France the previous year was largely down to them. They were considered elite forces. Manfred Gusovius was a 21-year-old tank commander.
We certainly had the feeling that we were like a modern elite cavalry. That's what they made us think. We were also told that it was something like we were a little bit better.
This is the man who built up the Wehrmacht's panzer force, Heinz Guderian, no Nazi, but an ardent anti-communist and a battle-hardened commander.
He was always on the front line and would turn up everywhere. For that, he was respected, but also sometimes feared because he always called a spade a spade.
For the panzer forces, Guderian was our idol. Not just because we liked him, but because he had led the tank troops magnificently, with brilliant tactics and brilliant strategy. We owed our success to Guderian.
But the captured German generals at Trent Park see their illustrious colleague differently.
I remember when Guderian heard about the Russian business for the first time. I was there. He said, "What? Another act of stupidity? Not that. Russia is so colossal. It just can't be done."
3 days before it began, Guderian came to see us. At that time, he believed in it himself. He said he had once been firmly against it, but now the orders had been issued. And he went wild with enthusiasm and almost believed what he said himself, even though his views were once the exact opposite.
It was certainly normal to express doubts about the success of an operation and about its preparations in exchanges with colleagues. But we shouldn't attach too much importance to this source. As an anti-communist, Guderian believed in Operation Barbarossa. He wanted to wage this war, and he wanted to wage it successfully. And we know from other documents that in June 1941 he also believed that he could successfully execute the attack on Moscow.
En route to Moscow, showing enthusiasm on demand, his soldiers call him Fast Heinz.
Guderian had chosen the right motto for his tactics. That's just what we were, fast. We could travel up to 120, 150 kilometers a day, naturally when we were not fighting, when there was no opposition. So we were always turning up at places where we weren't expected. We were maneuverable, and we could communicate with each other through throat microphones. That was a huge advantage for the German panzer forces, because we could change direction just like that. If we broke through their defenses, we had instructions to advance deep into enemy territory without worrying about any threats on our right or left.
They were absolutely at their peak. I mean, they had prepared for this, thought about it, they had seen what worked well. And so this extraordinary combination of tanks, aircraft, armoured vehicles and so on was virtually unstoppable.
Don't do it small, do it big, was Guderian's motto. Break the Red Army's defences with panzer vectors supported by artillery and the Air Force. Would Stalin give in? Would the Soviet colossus collapse, as the German strategists hoped? In the summer of 1941, the Wehrmacht went from one victory to the next.
We hardly had time to think. The first moment came about 3 weeks after we had constantly been advancing and constantly been in battle. I had a friend in the company and we talked about it. What is it with the Russians? What's happening? Will they really be finished in a few weeks? And it was obvious to us that it wasn't true. The propaganda we heard just wasn't true. We had seen for ourselves how tough the Russian soldiers were and how willing they were to sacrifice themselves.
Statistically, a soldier now had 2.5 years to live. But any day could be his last.
All of a sudden came the call, Faust and group to advance. And I didn't say anything. But my friend Eckerhardt yelled, "We're coming."
The order? To take out a pocket of resistance in a village.
We were about 20 meters away when we were hit by a hail of hand grenades. One of them fell next to Eckerhardt and exploded. He screamed. The machine gunner on my right came by and said, "I'm wounded." His hand was hanging by a thread. He just ripped it off and said, "I've got to go back." I was the only one left who could shoot when the Russians started their counterattack. I was only just able to save myself by running back between the Russians.
Otto has to leave his friend Eckerhardt behind.
I completely broke down. Because my friend kept calling from the village, "Otto, Otto." Then our company commander, who knew we were friends, ordered an armored personnel carrier forward. "Go and get it." They drove up. 10 minutes later, the NCO, the medic, came back alone. He said, "The car's gone. Everyone else is dead."
Costly victories. Almost 60,000 German soldiers are killed in only 6 weeks, and the end of the campaign is not in sight.
The number of casualties was substantially higher than expected. Munitions use was substantially higher, and the wear and tear on equipment was substantially higher. And all that affected, upset the original predictions and brought the whole system to a complete collapse.
What to do now? Guderian and the Army High Command want to concentrate everything on Moscow. But Hitler decides differently.
The generals are brought up with a traditional view that a war is won when you take the enemy's capital city, after a decisive battle in which the enemy's army is defeated. But Hitler held the modern view of war. He knew that a modern, mechanized war would not be won on the battlefield alone, but in the manufacturing plants. That's why it was vital to seize the factories and eliminate the Soviet Union's ability to conduct the war.
Thus, Guderian has to turn his panzer divisions south towards the Ukraine, the Soviet Union's breadbasket and source of raw materials. Behind Kiev, the Wehrmacht traps several Soviet armies in the middle of August 1941. The fighting lasts 3 weeks. Then the victory of the Wehrmacht is complete. One more victory.
When they said, "We've done it," that was an incredible relief inside. It was overwhelming to watch those long lines of prisoners going by, combined with the feeling, I never want to experience that, and also the thought, those poor guys.
But for the Wehrmacht's leadership, Red Army troops deserved no respect as fellow soldiers. It was racist mania.
The Russians realized they were seen as inferiors and subhumans by the Germans. I can't deny it. If I denied that, I would be lying.
The officers in Trent Park speak quite openly about the treatment of Russian prisoners.
The return transports of the Russians after the encirclement battles were ghastly.
They really were ghastly. I saw one of those transports. At the stations, the Russians peered out of those small hatches and screamed, "Bread, God will bless you." Then children arrived and brought pumpkins. The pumpkins were thrown into the carriages, and all you could hear were thudding and stumbling sounds and incredible screams. They were probably killing each other. I couldn't take it, and I asked the staff sergeant, "Have you nothing they can eat?" He replied, "Herr Oberstleutnant, where is it supposed to come from? We have nothing prepared."
No, really. These are unimaginable atrocities. Some of the prisoners were even taken back on foot. We drove along that road many times. The ditches were full of Russians that shot. It was dreadful.
We will be referred to as the Hun forever now. It makes you feel ashamed.
Never before and never again would the German generals reflect so openly and critically on the crimes committed against the masses of Soviet prisoners. And what's so extraordinary is that they clearly spoke their minds. They said the Wehrmacht is guilty of these crimes. It was the responsibility of the Wehrmacht.
At least 2.5 million die. Most from hunger or illness. The Wehrmacht takes almost 3.5 million prisoners by the fall of 1941. Hitler believes the Soviet Union is on the brink of collapse.
The initial German campaign, of course, took a huge quantity of the Soviet resources. It took around about 60 million of its population and around about 2/3 of its industrial and raw material capacity. The Red Army had suffered exceptional degree of damage. Most states would have given up, and I think that Hitler's view was not an irrational one. I mean, I think what he had underestimated was simply the sheer unwillingness of the Soviet people and the Soviet regime to abandon the conflict.
It is fall when the Wehrmacht again takes up the postponed attack on Moscow. According to the Blitzkrieg plan, the campaign should already be over Now the roads turned to mud.
It did occur to us, damn it, how are we supposed to carry on if it keeps raining like this? On the other hand, our objective, Moscow, was quite clear. We had to get there.
Tracked vehicles can still advance, but the Wehrmacht does not consist of tanks alone. Most of it is infantry, hardly more mechanized than their fathers were in World War I. And most of the artillery is pulled by horses, just as in the Kaiser's army. Karl Gottfried Vierkorn is a 20-year-old gunner.
Those poor creatures who were least responsible for the war, they had to be the most patient, and they had to suffer the most. Our veterinarian kept racing up and down the gigantic column, always with a needle in his hand, to get the horses that had collapsed back on their feet. It was terrible.
The Russian winter comes earlier than usual in 1941. And it's colder.
Our weapons didn't work anymore, but the Russian Kalashnikovs did. The Russian gunners could shoot. The engines of their trucks started, but not ours. We weren't prepared for those cold temperatures.
Caught unprepared, at temperatures down to minus 40 degrees Celsius.
In the freezing cold, in that terrible winter, I saw a gun crew frozen in the position in which they'd been firing. They were kneeling behind their gun, 3, 4 men, frozen into blocks of ice.
The Wehrmacht are losing more people through frostbite than through enemy action. Nothing works anymore. In Trent Park in England, the captured generals shudder when they think back to those weeks in the Russian winter of 1941.
Our comrades in Russia.
I don't think there can be a single family that isn't suffering terrible pain. The wounded were packed into freight wagons on bales of straw. The next day, they'd all frozen to death.
Dead?
Dead. Because none of the wagons were heated. There was absolutely no clothing either. The tank personnel were all wearing their civilian shoes. We took the felt boots off of every dead Russian, took off their clothes. They were cleaned a little and handed out again.
December the 5th, 1941, the Panzer Vanguard of the Wehrmacht is poised to enter Moscow.
We got to within 10 or 12 kilometers of Moscow. Then I had to blow up the vehicle. After that, I had to go back on foot.
The Soviet counterattack. Fresh, rested ski divisions that Stalin has transferred from Siberia to defend Moscow.
There was only one thing to do, flee to the left, away from the road, pursued by the ski divisions and by tanks. And we ran. I pulled out my pistol and thought, if you get wounded now, take your pistol and hold it to your head. Many men were already lying dead behind me, killed with bayonets. Maybe 15 or 20 of us reached the edge of the forest, out of 300.
The Wehrmacht has suffered its first defeat. The dream of a quick victory is gone.
Not being able to take Moscow was a huge disappointment. especially for an army with the motto, "We can do it." But we didn't do it. That had never happened before to a panzer division. And, of course, it made us think.
Hitler gives the order: stand firm at any cost. No retreat. He himself takes over command of the army, dismissing all the top generals. Even Panzer General Heinz Guderian, he had dared to move his units back a little against Hitler's orders. And for that he has to go. His men can't believe it.
We said, how can you dismiss an expert like that on such incomprehensible grounds? It was a real blow to a confident bunch like us in the tank forces with our esprit de corps. We didn't like that.
A year later, the circumstances of Guderian's dismissal still anger his comrades in captivity in England.
Actually, Guderian is a decent man. I have known him since he was a captain. But he allowed Hitler to treat him like a snotty child. Hitler gave him a bollocking and threw him out. Guderian asked for a review. He told me this himself, but he was turned down. At home in Berlin, he was a non-entity. He said to me, "I'm ashamed to go to the barbers, because they will ask me, what are you doing here?"
Does Hitler often visit the troops in the East?
Never. They haven't been able to get him to visit the army groups in ages. Only in an absolute emergency. He stays at home and locks himself in. Absolute tyrannical lunacy.
After the Moscow crisis, Hitler increasingly makes decisions on his own, but the generals obey. Later, they will say Hitler threw away victory by delaying the march on Moscow.
After the war, many of the generals had this obsession, I think, with capturing Moscow. Now, although Moscow had real symbolic significance, I'm not entirely convinced that the capture of Moscow itself would have led to the end of Red Army resistance, any more than Napoleon's capture of Moscow allowed the Grand Army to defeat Russia.
February 1942. The Wehrmacht is on the defensive for the first time, and it gets a taste of its own medicine. At Demyansk, near Lake Ilmen, 6 German divisions are trapped by the Red Army. 95,000 German soldiers are cut off. They can only be supplied by air. Defeat is only a matter of time. Outside this pocket, 35 kilometers away from the trapped army, General Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach arrives. He has instructions to break through the Russian siege line. Joachim Sandau was with him.
General von Seydlitz always walked around with a rifle, which was something really unusual for a general. A general didn't turn up carrying a rifle. He did. If you turn up with a rifle slung over your shoulder, you've already got the soldiers on your side, and that's how it was.
Walter von Seydlitz, a general without vanity.
He took the time to talk to everyone, be he officer, non-commissioned officer, or a sapper, or an infantryman.
He came from one of the most prestigious Prussian military families. His daughter Ingrid remembers.
War immer sehr, sehr liebenswürdig. He was always very, very friendly. He didn't care if you were a mailman or Count so-and-so. That didn't matter to him at all. He did have a strong sense of duty, though. I recognized that even as a child. He was also raised to believe that if you came from an old aristocratic line, you carried a great responsibility and that you had to live up to it.
Noblesse oblige. It was no empty phrase for Seydlitz. Heinrich Graf von Einsiedel got to know him in 1943.
Seydlitz was a brave, upstanding, clear-thinking soldier. In military matters, he was a clear-thinking soldier. In politics, he was, well, totally uneducated. Seydlitz himself said to me he didn't notice anything special about Hitler except his badly fitting uniforms and his awful table manners.
Seydlitz will be one of the few Wehrmacht generals to openly oppose Hitler. But it hasn't come to that yet. On March the 20th, 1942, he orders the attack on the Soviet positions near Demyansk. Four weeks later, the assault troops have fought their way to the trapped army.
Not a single village was left standing around the area where we attacked. The battle had gone back and forth several times, and naturally, nothing was left.
The supply lines to the units at Demyansk are open again. And Walter von Seydlitz is the hero of the day.
That was, of course, a very big operational success for Seydlitz, without a doubt. But it had a lethal effect, because at the Armed Forces High Command and at the Army High Command, they now believed it was possible to supply an army group from the air. And this belief, this mistaken belief, was to have fatal consequences later in 1942.
Spring 1942. More and more fresh Wehrmacht units arrive in Russia. But this picture is deceptive.
In June 1941, around two-thirds of all divisions were deemed, as they used to say, attack ready. By March 1942, that was down to just 5%. By that, we can see that the army that began the invasion in 1941, to all intents and purposes, no longer existed.
By March 1942, the Wehrmacht has lost 1 million men. They're especially short of front-line officers.
The company commander at that time summoned me and said, "If you prove yourself, you can become an officer cadet." I told that to everyone in my vehicle, and the driver started yelling and said, "We drive all the way out here from Germany, and now this guy comes and tells us we have to prove ourselves?" In Russia, a lieutenant in the mechanized infantry lasted on average 11 days. Then he was gone.
Most of the companies are led by corporals and sergeants. You have to look at it soberly. We are losing too many men in these battles. They waste too many lives and too much blood.
There's nobody left. In the Russian offensive of the last war, I only had to replace my officers' corps once.
The enemy's strength increases from month to month, while ours declines. As early as January, the ammunition supply was suspended. In January, in the midst of the fighting, they stopped sending us ammunition. I had a mortar battery and didn't fire a single shot for weeks. For weeks, not days.
Yep. You can't load cannons with philosophy.
Nevertheless, Hitler expects the Wehrmacht to win 2 more victories. One, to seize the Russian oil reserves on the Black Sea, and 2, to capture the city of Stalingrad. At the same time.
Operationally, this decision was a disaster. It meant dividing the invasion force in half, thereby increasing the chances of defeat in Stalingrad as well as in the Caucasus.
November 1942. Most of Stalingrad has been occupied by the Wehrmacht. The Red Army begins another counter-offensive. Now the Soviets have mastered the very tactics that dealt them such devastating defeats at the beginning of the campaign.
The Red Army learnt lessons from the Wehrmacht, and they learnt how to fight the same way that the Germans fought. The great irony, I think, of this is that the Wehrmacht, in fact, were the teachers for the Red Army that eventually defeated them.
November the 22nd, 1942, the Red Army has completely surrounded the German soldiers at Stalingrad.
There were anti-aircraft batteries. I could see them through my binoculars. And I thought, that's where we've got to go. And someone came up to me, "For God's sake, man, don't go there." "Well, yes, they are German guns, but the crews are Russians." I said, "What?" The Russians had come up from behind, and that's when I knew all was lost.
Cut off, even General Seydlitz. Hitler had ordered the soldiers in Stalingrad to dig in and hold fast, like in Demyansk. But Seydlitz knows perfectly well Stalingrad is not Demyansk. You can't supply more than 200,000 men from the air. So he decides to take an unprecedented step. He writes a memo to his superiors.
Es galt noch ein letztes Mal klarzumachen,
I attempted, for one last time, to make it clear that our only hope lay in immediately breaking through the enemy lines, if necessary against Hitler's orders. At the end of our memo, we urged the army to take matters into their own hands if the order to hold fast wasn't rescinded. We had to act, responsible only to our conscience and to the German people.
Dem Gewissen und dem deutschen Volke.
This was unheard of. A Prussian general calling for disobedience against the supreme commander, out of a sense of duty to his own soldiers. Stalingrad, the end of January 1943.
The blast threw me on my back, and as I turned round I saw my own blood. It was a little light in colour, and I thought, damn, the lungs. My sergeant came to me, took my hand, put my pistol into it, and said, "Sir, very soon the Russians will be coming, and we can't take you back with us."
The wound probably saves Hans Erdmann Schönbeck's life. He's evacuated from Stalingrad on one of the last planes.
My pistol and the sergeant stayed behind in the combat zone.
It's the end. On February the 2nd, 1943, the remains of the 6th Army surrender.
To be frank, I wasn't really thinking. I only saw that I wasn't going to be killed by the men who were standing around guarding us. And that was the point where I said, from now on, I will try to survive in any decent way possible. Not even to get home, just to survive.
What awaits these men? 91,000 German soldiers are taken prisoner in Stalingrad. Only 6,000 will make it home. One of them is Manfred Gusovius, after more than 10 years of war and captivity.
The Russian word судьба. Судьба means something like fate. That had a deep meaning for me when I repeated it to myself then. You know what I mean?
Stalingrad. It was more than just the end of an army.
There was no longer a German strategy after Stalingrad. The only thing was to win time, to give the regime a reprieve before the final collapse. And this process dragged on for more than 2 years and claimed about double the victims the war had claimed up to 1943.
The Wehrmacht fights on. For most, the question of whether to give up or even change sides does not arise.
I was a German officer. I couldn't have done it. That's all I can say.
Heinz Otto Fausten is wounded in 1943 and loses a leg. For the fatherland. For the Führer.
When the nurse changed my dressings, it was unbelievably painful. And the only way I could deal with the pain was to put up a postcard-sized picture of Adolf on the wall. Then I stuck out my hand and yelled, "Heil, you pig!"
Summer 1943. Near Kursk, the Wehrmacht panzers advance again. In vain. The hunters have finally become the hunted.
The Wehrmacht lost the initiative. They'd held the initiative for 2 years. They've been able to decide where to go, what to do, which operations to mount. But from the summer of 1943 onwards, the initiative lay with the Red Army.
Meanwhile, in Trent Park.
Our situation is hopeless. Doesn't matter where we attack. We cannot advance. We can achieve nothing. We no longer have the human materials we had at the beginning of the offensive. What is lost cannot be replaced.
The astonishing thing is that a few of them already realized in 1943 that the war was lost. But the question is, what conclusions did they draw from this? Most of them say Hitler is to blame for the result of the war. Other generals are to blame, not me. And only very, very few get past this mental block to say, no, I'm also responsible for everything that's been done in the name of Germany.
One of the few is Walter von Seydlitz. While a prisoner of war in Russia, he completely breaks with Hitler. In the League of German Officers organized by the Russians, he calls on his Wehrmacht comrades to overthrow the Nazi regime.
The act of salvation must emerge from the bitter lesson of Stalingrad. Do everything in your power to make sure that it doesn't happen without you, or even in spite of you.
Seydlitz remains who he is, a conservative patriot. He refuses to cooperate with Stalin. Hitler sentences him to death in absentia.
We knew that we were traitors to the Hitler regime, but we're still proud of that, because our whole intention was to prevent the suicide of the German Reich, and as far as possible to shorten and avert this terrible catastrophe that had befallen Germany.
Heinz Guderian, the Panzer strategist, was at the opposite end of the spectrum. Hitler called him back into service in 1943, first as inspector of panzer troops and then chief of the general staff. After the war, he became a consultant for the formation of the new West German army. Karl Gottfried Vierkorn also had an invitation to join the new German army, but he preferred a civilian career. Heinz Otto Fausten studied art after the war. He became a teacher and a headmaster. After 1945, Hans Erdmann Schönbeck worked in the car industry. They're still haunted by their war experiences.
The war surfaces again and again. While you're sleeping, when you dream that you have to attack. And you hear the clanking of tank tracks. And you're afraid.
Another new look at the Wehrmacht tomorrow at 5, part of Front Line here on the History Channel, where next it's Battlefield Detectives.